Welcome to this video about the impossible turn for air traffic controllers, losing the only engine during initial climb. For the record, I'm filming this on February 15th of 2021. To get started, let me first give you a definition of the impossible turn, but I thought, I'd do the work myself. Let's let Google do the work. So let's Google, what is the impossible turn in aviation? And the first thing that it came up with is something from Airfax Journal. It says the impossible turn is actually quite a vague phrase. It generally refers to a low altitude 180 degree turn back to the departure airport after experiencing an engine failure on takeoff. The classic scenario involves a sudden power loss below 1,000 feet, and the only thing that proves so far is that I know how to read. But you can also see there are lots of hits about it. AOPA, engine failure on climb out leads to the impossible turn. FAAsafety.gov has something about the impossible turn. Your engine failed after takeoff. Should you return to the runway or the airport or whatever, right? What I want to cover in this video is what controllers should be doing when somebody loses an engine shortly after takeoff and says something like, I want to come back. So what we're going to do is get started in the PowerPoint for just a second, and then we'll spend some time looking at short snippets from a number of YouTube videos. So first of all, I am going to argue that for controllers there are 3, not 2 tasks that I would recommend tower controllers perform when we have a situation like this. The first 2 tasks are tasks that we already do quite well, and tower controllers already do these 2 tasks just fine to a first approximation, and the last thing you need is some dude who works at a center, it's not a tower, telling you how to do your job. So just for the record, and you're doing a fine job already, essentially the 2 tasks are saying something like cleared to land, and maybe it's going to be cleared to land any runway, but cleared to land and move other traffic out of the way as necessary. So for example, and we're not going to look at this video, but when Harrison Ford had his engine failure out of Santa Monica a few years ago, he took off, was shortly after takeoff saying engine failure, immediate return. Because runway 21 was in use, the tower controller immediately responded, clear to land 21, and he had other traffic in the pattern. Ford immediately said, nope, I need runway 3. The tower controller said clear to land runway 3 and started moving other traffic. We tower controllers already do that. You're doing just fine. I'm sure somewhere, there's some areas where it can be tweaked. But there's a third task that I want my tower controller colleagues to think about, including what I want you to tell me if it's my butt in the airplane. I'm the one with the engine failure just after takeoff, and I want you to help save my life and keep me from being stupid. I mean it. So what I want to do is jump over to YouTube, basically. We're going to kind of skim through a number of YouTube videos, and since you always cheat, I'm sure you do, don't deny it, you can see I've got a couple things up there besides just some YouTube stuff, including some Google Maps stuff. This first one we're not going to watch at all. I'm just going to invite you to look at it if you want on your own. This is an AOPA real pilot story video entitled Power Loss on Takeoff, and so this pilot talks about what happened to him when he was just off departure from Winslow, Arizona, and that's kind of an animated picture there. But he landed off airport, dinged the airplane up, walked away. He did the right thing. It's an interesting interview. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through it. By the way, I'm as concerned with understanding the physics and aerodynamics of what's going on in this stuff as I am the ATC interaction in some sense. So even though this particular accident took place at an uncontrolled airport, it's still perfectly relevant for understanding what controllers need to understand about these situations. This landing is a success, even though the airplane was basically destroyed. Okay, this one here, Real Pilot Story, The Impossible Turn. This is the story about a gentleman named Dave Keller who was taking off in his Mooney from Anderson, Indiana, and as part of this AOPA Real Pilot Story, they interviewed both the pilot and the controller, plus Mr. Keller provided some of the onboard footage from this, and so let's watch. Actually, when I was previewing getting this set up, that's where I wanted to end, basically, so let's start here at about the 144 mark.
When I got about between 450 and 500 feet above the ground, the engine broke. A cylinder came apart.
Just off the departure end, probably about half a mile to a mile, and called back to the tower, advised they had engine trouble, and said just want to come back to land.
fueling is coming back. Something's going wrong with the engine. What's your number? You just want to look 1-2? We'll just put her down wherever we can.
I instinctively turned the plane around. I made a right turn and began a gradual descent. I was afraid that there might have been some damage, and I was thinking I ought to stop the prop so that it wouldn't make more damage inside the engine. I don't know why I'd be concerned about the engine, but that thought crossed my mind, and I thought, well, I'll pull a mixture. And the prop still didn't stop, and I realized that, I should have pulled the propeller control to actually stop the prop, but I didn't think of that.
My thoughts were just to get ready, call it dispatch emergency vehicles and get everything ready in case he did have a mishap upon landing. Just to be quiet, let him fly his plane.
I was trying to clear the trees in the shortest distance, and that took me almost perpendicular to the runway. Once I knew I had them cleared, then I was trying to crank the plane back to line up with the runway.
And we'll go ahead and end there. He did get it successfully landed on the runway. That horn you heard in the background there at the very end was the stall horn as he was getting very close to stalling the airplane. Sometimes pilots are just high enough they can make it back. I don't want to get into too much detail about any of these because we have several to go through, but I will note that there was some quick discussion about whether he wanted runway 12. These things happen so fast that tower controllers, if you can, just clear them to land any runway, and the pilot doesn't even know yet. There is so much going on at this time. Okay, the next one we're going to look at, and again, I prepped this and then I didn't reset it, so let's go back to 752, and this is a guy that's close enough. I will note this is his third solo flight. That's incredible. This is his third solo flight because what he does is absolutely some fantastic airmanship here. But let's watch this. Okay, fantastic airmanship for a guy on his third solo to put it down in the driving range of a golf course instead of trying to stretch the glide to the runway. So here's where he was, Concord. He ended up trying to go for one left, but then late on he realized he wasn't going to make it. So he came right in over this intersection, landed on the driving range right here, and I think he was actually kind of off in this direction, so the fence might be here. But in any case, fantastic airmanship. Good job with the pilot. He's not sure which runway. He talks about one right, said he ends up kind of going for one left. That changes. These plans are going to change so fast. Controllers, I would recommend you don't get into a conversation. Again, if you can at all, just clear them to land any runway and don't get into the conversation. They'll figure it out. They might adjust late. And I know we don't hear the ATC audio directly, but clearly Tower there was asking for fuel on board, souls on board. Please do not do that. Please stop. In these low altitude engine failure situations, the pilot has so many things going on. If the pilot's going to volunteer something like I'm landing in this field short of the runway or whatever, so be it. I do not like the idea at all of tower controllers asking for fuel on board, souls on board. Now, for those of you who say, no, we need that because we're rolling the trucks, here's the deal. If you distract the pilot, you are adding risk to the situation, and that is going to affect the survivability negatively. Okay, if we don't ask, then presumably we're not going to know unless a pilot in some rare case volunteers it. Guess what? We're going to figure that out in 10 seconds as soon as we get down there. And let me just tell you what the answers are anyway. All these airplanes, some of these, the answer is like 1 or 2, and you'll figure it out right away whether you've asked them or not. And the fuel, it's 100 gallons or less. Boom, you're done. I answered it for you. No need to ask the pilot who is up to his or her eyeballs. So tower controllers, please don't do that. For what it's worth, he ended up in a golf course just short of one left at Concord. We're not going to watch the Harrison Ford video, but when he took off in his Ryan several years ago, okay, and he was somewhere out about here when he had the engine failure, where are you going to go? He attempted to turn back, went for 3, even though initially he was cleared to land 2-1 because that was the runway in use. He ends up going to be short, and so he flew it into the golf course here. From the NTSB report, he clipped the top of a 65-foot tree, probably this one, and ended up right here. Man, it's hard to say, but it seems like he got a little bit lucky. It's tough on these pilots, but once you realize you're not going to make it in this particular situation, here I'm trying to be generic, if you realize somewhere back here you're not going to make it, it's better to purposely glide poorly and probably get it down and slowed on something like a par 5, okay? And frankly, he actually might have been lucky to clip the top of the tree. If he'd gone over the tree just a few feet higher, still flying, there's a good chance, especially because there's an upslope here, that turned out rather poorly. So, but tower controllers, there are so many things for a pilot to think about in assessing that stuff. Do not get into extra conversation with them about anything. Don't ask them if the engine failure is total or partial. Again, fuel on board, souls on board, stuff like that. Okay, don't tell them we're rolling the equipment. Now, by all means, roll the equipment, but don't tell them that and distract them from the task they need to do. All right, let's watch another one. This is footage taken from a skydiver's GoPro attached to their helmet just after takeoff from Sussex, New Jersey. And I know the interior of this plane looks pretty darn ugly. A lot of these skydiving planes, they strip them, to reduce the weight so they can carry an extra person up the altitude quickly. This guy is going to be faced with some poor landing choices. He has almost no choice but to make a hard right turn at a low airspeed into a field. He does it successfully, but listen carefully for the stall horn late in the sequence. They all got out okay. The plane did flip, which does happen sometimes in the field, but generally speaking, there can be exceptions. You get it down to a field, you get it slowed, even if the plane flips a little bit later, the outcomes tend to be pretty good. For what it's worth, this pilot had no real choice but to make a turn. Here's the Sussex airport he was taking off to the south, and he was faced with basically these trees, and so he does a 180, kind of riding the stall horn, ends up back somewhere about in here. I don't have the exact location down to the foot. But that pilot is flirting with the stall, and if he pulls back just a little too much on that yoke, it's a classic stall spin type of accident. Here's one. We're going to pick this up sort of in progress rather late in the game, and just to keep the timing down, I'm not going to spend much time really on the setup for it. We're going to pick up here at the 5:45 mark and just watch about 15 seconds because it's going to switch from Victor's normal radar simulation view to actual footage of the touchdown itself. You'll notice from the thing it says down here, the airplane crashed into a house. I will note that the 3 people on board did survive.
Hold short runway 3 on right.
Holding short 3 on right, 00 Delta.
Very slow, nose is up because he's trying to stretch it, makes that turn, and it kind of pancakes stall maneuver into the house, and then there's a slow motion replay. But that's what happens if you pull back just too much, you stall the airplane. Sometimes, depending on how badly it stalls and what you do, that nose might drop immediately. Sometimes it might kind of do a pancake maneuver for just a little bit, and so on. It's not always quite this pleasant. This is one that was picked up on security camera footage in Hanson, Massachusetts about a year ago, and the Aranca Champ that's just coming into the frame here on the left. By the way, the audio is turned off here. This security camera footage, the only audio it picks up is like an airplane in the foreground that you can't see that's doing an engine run-up, so I've just muted this one. He's going to lose the engine right about the time he comes over the end of the runway at just a couple hundred feet or so. He'll start a left turn, apparently trying to come back, but watch what happens. And yes, that was fatal. Sometimes the stall spin, again, it just takes a little too much pull. You got to really sort of walk the tightrope as a pilot. Just a little too much pull, stall or stall spin, that nose comes down, and those tend to be very unsurvivable. Let's look at another one. This one, clearly survivable, and it was in fact in some sense a normal landing on a runway. This is out of Tamiami, and this one there was some extra data shared by the pilot, so I'll start here and we're going to watch just over a minute. But I do want you to note that he landed on 27 right, but listen carefully to the exchanges that go on with the comms.
Aviator 5, correction, ADF 5, Charlie Victor, San Diego Tower, we're not right, clear for takeoff. ADF 67 Hotel, San Diego Tower, advance, make straight in, runway 9 right.
Advance on main screen to runway 9 right, ADF 69 Hotel.
ADF 67 Hotel, runway 9 right, clear to land.
Runway 9 right, clear to land, ADF 69 Hotel. Miami Tower, ADF 5 Charlie Victor, we need to come back.
ADF 5 Charlie Victor, roger, do you require any assistance?
Hey, Firma, we're turning and back to the runway, ADF 5 Charlie Victor.
ADF 5 Charlie Victor, roger, you can land runway 27 left if you'd like. Your number 1, runway 27 left, clear to land.
27 left, clear to land, we got an emergency, mayday, we got a smoke in the cabin. Landing runway 27 right, ADF 5 Charlie Victor.
ADF 5 Charlie Victor, roger, runway 27 right, cleared to land.
27 right, clear to land, ADF 5 Charlie Victor. Oh, ADF, you want me to change the runway 9 there?
Or 517 Hotel, making an immediate left turn northbound.
Yeah, we got it, 7 Hotel. They got a lot of smoke trailing out, roll the equipment.
Ram 60 ground.
I'll pause here. So initially he was clear to land 27 left. Good job by the controller. Okay, clearing them to land opposite direction in an emergency situation. Again, man, this sounds like I'm nitpicking. I don't like the controller when the guy says he has to come back and he's just taken off, going to require assistance. At that point, again, we don't know at that point what's going on, but generically speaking, somebody in a small airplane has a problem right after takeoff. Okay, either clear them to land on any runway or maybe don't clear them, but do you require any assistance or what's the nature of the emergency? It's so time critical, I would greatly prefer to avoid that. I can't somehow prohibit it. In any case, he was cleared to land 27 left. Presumably the controller was going to move that other airplane he had just cleared to land 9 right. In the meantime, even though the pilot read back 27 left, pilot exercised his PIC authority to go to 27 right instead. Okay, pilots will do that. So you get to these low altitude situations. Part of me is tempted to say tower controllers, you can clear them to land or you can not clear them to land. They're just going to do it anyway based on their PIC authority, which they have the absolute legal right to do. By all means, I'd say clear them to land. That does clear up any confusion or angst that the pilot has and so on. But there might be some cases where, for example, let's just say mayday, mayday, immediate engine failure coming back, and you've got other airplanes. Sometimes step one will be to move the other aircraft because it's so time critical. And don't even worry about the landing clearance. That will be a tough judgment call. It's easier said than done, but sometimes that's what you're going to want to do. For what it's worth, this guy shared some pictures of the airplane afterwards. The pool of oil on the ground is generally considered a bad thing, and this part should match up with this part, and this part should not maintain social distancing with that cooling fin on the cylinder head here. So clearly there was a major problem with one of the engine cylinders. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit. This one is actually from an FAA seminar that was given by a flight instructor who was talking about his power loss at 300 feet just after takeoff from Pearson Field in Vancouver, Washington, just across the river from Portland. In fact, it's very close to Portland International Airport. And I'm going to pick up, he goes on for a full hour, goes into lots of detail, wonderful thing if you watch it. But I just want to watch a short snippet of the actual audio and footage from the event. And he does make a successful downwind landing back on, I believe it's runway 8, if I'm not mistaken. But if you heard some of the noises that were going on there, when he made the right turn over the buildings, did you hear that stall horn going off? They were very close to a stall. And again, you're welcome to watch this entire 1-hour webinar. If I go forward, I'm just going to kind of freeze frame it here. At this point of the webinar, he's talking about getting into an accelerated stall, which they really flirted with, and if they had stalled at this point, that is likely deadly. And so he spends some time, obviously he's talking to pilots about the need to avoid this accelerated stall, and if you're not very careful. So let's switch gears a little bit. We're going to come out of the YouTube and all these examples of things and try to put some of this stuff together. In talking about the impossible turn, and there's lots of stuff out there, one of the things that I would mention to kind of get started here is this article from May of 2019 and published in General Aviation News entitled "The Impossible Turn is Now Possible." That's because there was a recent change in the laws of physics. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, it starts off when we posted online about a National Association of Flight Instructors live webinar about the impossible turn. More than 30 people commented. That's not unusual for a feature story, but almost unheard of for a story about an upcoming webinar. The strong response wasn't a surprise to Captain Brian Schiff. Brian Schiff, by the way, is the son of a legendary pilot, Barry Schiff. Barry Schiff, among 1,000 other accomplishments in his life, is actually the pilot who got Harrison Ford checked out in the Ryan at Santa Monica. And if you were to read through this whole article, we won't. It's going to talk about a particular engine out situation that his father, that Brian Schiff's father, Barry Schiff, had a long time ago. That was at Santa Monica, same place where Harrison had his engine out. So Harrison Ford had a good flight instructor. This is the son of the great flight instructor, right? But anyway, and I've talked to Captain Schiff about what his ideas are here. He does talk about how the FAA is kind of thinking about making some changes to the way that pilots are trained about the impossible turn. In effect, for a very long time, it's been somewhat simplistically taught to pilots, like, don't even think of turning back before you get to 1,000 feet, just go ahead and land in a field straight ahead. And that's still valid advice, and there's still a number of flight instructors who teach that. There are various people, including Captain Brian Schiff and others, who now are teaching pilots that as long as you do it properly, you can start to think about making the turn back, even if the engine fails at a somewhat lower altitude. By the way, here is the right way to make the turn. Now, the reason it's called the impossible turn, there's really two reasons for it. I will mention just very briefly, he does talk about the FAA making a change with Advisory Circular 61-83 Juliet. Now, that advisory circular is not about the impossible turn per se. What it's about is, and here's that advisory circular, it's about how to conduct a flight instructor refresher course. What are the topics when flight instructors have to take basically recurrent training every couple of years? If I go to page 47, well into the syllabus, there's a module where it's talking about how to teach flight instructors to teach pilots to avoid loss of control, okay, which is one of the most significant, if not the number one cause of GA fatalities for about the last 15 years. And loss of control, one of the significant threats is in the traffic pattern, including specifically the risk of loss of control if attempting to return to the airport after an engine failure on takeoff. And then one more, here is a whole section about that, including especially the need to avoid any potential for an accelerated stall in the turn. Okay, for what it's worth, here's the Airplane Flying Handbook. No surprise about what section we're going to look at. Chapter 17, Emergency Procedures. On page 17-6 is the discussion, somewhat simplistic, about engine failure after takeoff. And the gist of this does not really talk about the threat of the accelerated stall the way that I wish it would. This is basically saying that if you lose the engine, if you haven't thought about how much altitude you're going to lose in the turn back, so you might lose the engine at, say, 300 feet, try to make your turn, and you're going to be 1,000 feet underground by the time you get to the runway. It's still perpendicular, at least for this kind of sample airplane. This advice can be updated a little bit, but what happens is inherently, and again, each situation will be unique, that's the real problem. And what happens is pilots start the turn, and maybe they start off a little bit higher, but they start the turn, and there's kind of two threats. The more benign threat is, well, you're just not going to make it, and then you're going to have to switch to plan B kind of late, and you're going to end up in a golf course or a whatever. Okay, the bigger threat, though, is as the pilot starts to turn, you hear the siren call of the runway, and as you're trying to keep the turn tight, and as the ground's kind of coming up at you, the pilot sort of subconsciously just pulls more and more and more on the yoke or the stick, and they maybe don't hear that stall horn, and they stall the airplane, and that's when you get that stall spin, and that can be fatal, even in one of the slower aircraft, like an Aranca Champ. I've heard it said about Piper Cubs, that it's a safe airplane. They're just barely fatal, when they do a stall spin into the ground. You don't want to do a stall spin in any aircraft. Those tend to be very bad. Another example of somebody who's talking about how you can start that impossible turn much lower. Here's a more technical paper written by a professor in the Aerospace Engineering Department at the United States Naval Academy, and he's saying that is the optimum flight path is a 45-degree bank angle at just barely above stall during the turn, and if you do that, you can start the turn back at a slightly lower altitude than a lot of pilots think about. He goes through all the math that just makes my eyes glaze over. He goes through some actual number crunching and presents all kinds of fancy graphics. He clearly spent more time on his stuff than I do. However, there is one thing I do want to kind of take issue with. So at the end of the paper, he asks, can the pilot execute this maneuver? He says, based on statistics obtained from accident investigations conducted by the NTSB, the FAA and most general aviation safety experts conclude that a low level, so low altitude, high bank angle turn is likely to result in a classic stall spin accident with little chance of survival. Unfortunately, little attempt at validating the database with respect to its completeness has been attempted. In fact, it's reasonable to conclude that the statistical accident incident database is incomplete. For example, if a turn back maneuver after engine failure is successfully completed or results in only minor damage, then generally no report is made to either the FAA or the NTSB. And so therefore the statistics are a little bit skewed. On that point, he's absolutely right, and yet at the same time I also feel like it's also a little bit misleading, because low altitude loss of control is one of the leading causes, if not the single biggest cause, of fatalities in general aviation aircraft. So even if there are other successful turn back maneuvers that never get reported, so they don't make it in the database, it still remains true that low altitude loss of control. Now, to be clear, not all low altitude loss of control incidents are from engine failures just after takeoff, but a significant fraction are. Therefore, even though I think this first paragraph, he's absolutely right, and I totally agree, I nonetheless feel like it's slightly misleading. I want controllers to think of a low altitude engine failure after takeoff, whether it's full failure or partial failure, as an absolutely life-threatening incident, and I think the statistics bear that out. And then in the second paragraph, he says, although the turn back maneuver is a high-performance edge of the envelope maneuver, there is good evidence that a well-trained pilot is capable of successfully performing it. I agree. Jet, and that's the writer of another technical paper, Jet in the simulator study, well, isn't that a great name, by the way, Jet? Jet in the simulator study reported in reference 3 showed that with minimal training, over 90% of pilots with more than 100 hours of flight time were able to successfully complete the maneuver using a 45-degree bank angle and a velocity of approximately, and I'm going to say just barely over the stall speed that would occur while you're in that bank angle. Furthermore, the turn back maneuver is a standard required maneuver for the glider rating. An applicant for a glider rating, by the way, I hold a commercial glider rating. I've been flying gliders since I was 14 years old. I have done this maneuver. An applicant for a glider rating must demonstrate, starting from an altitude of 200 feet AGL, the ability to turn back to the departure runway when the tow rope breaks. By the way, that's the glider analog to an engine failure after takeoff, before qualifying for the rating. I've had to do that, done it a number of times. An unpowered single-engine aircraft is simply a glider with a lower lift-to-drag ratio than a sailplane. Fundamentally, the only difference between a sailplane and an unpowered single-engine aircraft is the critical altitude required to successfully complete the maneuver. Again, I agree with that on a technical level. I have a problem on a practical level, and here's what that problem is. And again, I'm speaking as somebody who has had to train for and demonstrate, okay, the simulated rope break at 200 feet AGL, and I have done these low altitude, extreme low altitude turnbacks. Granted, they were in gliders, but here's one of the reasons why I think it's safer in a glider. Glider pilots, we spend a significant fraction of our glider time doing thermaling. Okay, it depends on what part of the country you're in and what kind of lift you have available to you, but a lot of glider pilots end up spending time thermaling. When you're thermaling, you're doing tight turns with a low radius, and to do that, you want a high bank angle and a slow speed. So glider pilots spend a great chunk of their flying time at something like a 45-degree bank angle and a velocity that's just above the stall speed for that bank angle. We sort of live there when we're thermaling, and frankly we do it in turbulence, and we really build up kind of a muscle memory about what that is like. And so in effect, when we're doing that same maneuver that we do on a regular basis at altitude down low, it's relatively straightforward. Let me jump back into YouTube and let me find an example of that. This was not hard to find on YouTube. This was posted by a guy who posts lots of stuff about gliding. He's done this for a number of years, Bruno Vassal, and this is one he posted from about 11 years ago, entitled Spin Entry During Rough Thermal. Okay, he's rolling into a right-hand turn. He's going to be thermaling. His variometer shows that he's climbing here. The airspeed indicator, he's definitely down near the stall. Okay, he's intending to do a tight turn at altitude. At a slow speed, he just happens to somewhat misjudge it, partly catches a little bit of a gustiness, which does happen in thermals, and you will see him start to get into a spin. Watch him get out of it very quickly, because glider pilots are effectively used to that. I can't tell how many times I've had this little incipient spin, just like Bruno's going to document here. Dean, would you please be quiet and run the video?
Enter into a spin. Gust spun me over.
Blame it on the wind, the gust. Anyway, watch again though. Watch how fast it goes. Right there, and then Bruno catches it very quickly. But of course, when you're thermaling at slow speed, you're kind of on high alert for that. Glider pilots kind of expect that and can recover fairly quickly. For an airplane pilot taking off who gets into that, there's just no recovery down at low altitude. These just tend to be fatal. Therefore, I agree with what this professor is saying in principle. The reality is, I think that these low altitude turnbacks, when pilots make them, they can be deadly if they don't protect against the stall. Therefore, and let me go back to the PowerPoint, what do I have in mind for what I'm calling task 3 for controllers? Please tell pilots when they make this low altitude turnback maneuver something like, do not stall. Do not stall. Picture, if you want, a controller telling that to the pilot of the Mooney in Anderson, Indiana, or the skydiving pilot. Again, granted, that was an uncontrolled field in Sussex, New Jersey. That airplane that kind of did the 172 pancake into the house as they were coming in, perhaps a Harrison Ford, okay, or some of these others. But when they come back in, I would really like to see controllers tell pilots, do not stall, do not stall. And I know that's not a normal controller thing. I get that, right? You think, well, are we really supposed to be doing that? My firm answer is yes, and what I would effectively cite on that is this advisory circular, okay, where it's saying one of the biggest causes of fatalities in GA airplanes is low altitude loss of control, and one of the biggest risks that leads to that is when pilots get into this accelerated stall in the turn. All you're doing, if you remind a pilot in that situation, do not stall, is you're just reminding them of standardized advice. And if it's a pilot who's really paying attention and not going to stall, they're really mindful of that, there's no harm. If it's somebody who is listening to that siren call of the runway, I think if you say, do not stall the airplane, it's going to help break into the pilot's head and remind them. And maybe they end up in a golf course landing under control. Maybe they land in a field under control. Maybe they make it back to the runway like the Mooney did in Anderson, Indiana, and they're just fine. But regardless, I want to avoid the stall spin, because it's the stall spin that is typically fatal, and that, I admit, is a change in the way we controllers think about things. So therefore, the tasks are cleared to land, and you can say any runway, or you can even kind of skip the clear to land part if you need to. Obviously move other traffic, but also please say do not stall, do not stall. And finally, just to wrap up, even if it's me, if I'm the pilot on your frequency and I have an engine failure after takeoff and I say I'm turning back, you know what? I'd like to think that I'm going to be smart enough, because of my experience and background and all that stuff, and glider background, to not stall the airplane. Please remind me, do not stall the aircraft. And maybe I'm going to be in some situation where I just think I can make the runway, and you're going to remind me, keep it under control, and it makes it more survivable. And then just for fun, I'll wrap up this way. One of the airports I fly out of is this one here. Let me go find it real quick. And It's fairly typical. This is a small airport on the west side of Indianapolis. It's fairly typical to take off on runway 36, okay? And if I take off on runway 36 from Hendricks County Airport here, okay, it's typical winds might be something like 300 at 8 to 10 or something like that. So winds are coming out of the northwest, take off on 36 with that left crosswind. I will tell you right now, in a typical GA airplane, if I am crossing the end of the runway here, at about 300 or 400 feet AGL, and my engine were to fail completely off the north end of the airport here with that kind of wind, I would make a left turn onto 36 and land successfully. Now, for those of you who are familiar with how well typical GA airplanes fly, and you think, how in the bloody, how is he going to be at 300 feet AGL and come all the way back to 36 and land successfully? And I guarantee that's what I'm going to do. Here's why. If I go a little farther, there's a divided highway just north of the airport. It's US Highway 36. I would put it down on that 36. I've pre-scouted the road. Heck, I've walked along that road. I've bicycled along that road for exercise sometimes. It's clear of power lines. That black car is there every dang time I look at this. I wish he'd get out of the way. But other than that, it's a clear stretch of road. I would be up here. I would make a left turn. I would go past where the Google car keeps taking its picture. I would touch down somewhere down around here. I would never catch that black car. I would avoid the speed limit sign with my right wingtip, and I would roll to a stop somewhere down about here and call it a day. There's nothing wrong if you need to with landing off airport as long as you keep it under control and don't stall. So I can say in truthfulness, runway 36 at Hendricks County, I would make a left turn in that situation and land on 36. 18 on the other hand, there's some fields down here. I might flip the airplane, so roll the trucks. And this is an uncontrolled field, but if it were a towered field, please remind me, do not stall the airplane and help keep me from doing harm to myself by listening to the siren call of the runway. Thank you.